Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Fieldwork Reflections, or welcome if you're new around here. If this is your first time, I'm Viviana Simos, and I'm writing a book all about cosplay. And in this kind of short run of a series, I'm going to be going through some of the notes and discussions and themes that have come up in the process of doing fieldwork on cosplay with cosplayers, and talking about what people have said and what their experiences are, and then I kind of sum it up with a little bit of a quick and dirty analysis. So today's topic of conversation, today's theme, if you will, is all about skill. Now, skill is something that I kind of expected to come up. For most people on the outside of cosplay, there's a lot of discussion and conversation around skill. Costume construction itself is an inherent skill. But even beyond that, there are other skills involved in just the simple process of putting together an outfit and the process of changing a person into a character. However, I think a more detailed conversation about skill came up than I was expecting. I kind of initially thought that skill would be scattered throughout the book, but not necessarily be given its own kind of section. But as it stands right now, I have a whole chapter dedicated to skill, because I think that it was a lot more nuanced and a lot more worthy of really detailed discussion than I initially thought it would be. I kind of thought that the discussion would be, yeah, people have skills in this stuff, and yeah, that's what happens. But it is a lot more than that. So let's get into the conversation about why that is. So there are two types of skills that I'm going to be talking about. One is that bit that we were talking about at the beginning, the idea of the costuming skill, the skill of costume construction, the skill of creating the actual thing. But the second one is a skill in regards to understanding identity is, I think, the way I'm going to phrase it for now. I might rephrase it in the future. Let me know what you think when we get there. So I'm going to kind of go into each one of these types of skill and what people said that kind of led me to seeing this skill in what people were saying, as well as in their experiences of it. And then I'll do kind of a quick discussion of anthropological ideas of skill and how I think it relates to all this stuff in cosplay in the last section of the video. So obviously, the first thing to talk about is what I think everyone thinks of when we talk about skill in regards to cosplay, which is the skill involved in the actual costume construction or the costume, because it's not always construction, right? It can be other things. So, for example, my cosplay that I did, which I can link to in the description, I'll link to a discussion where I talked a little bit more about that. I found my pieces at charity shops, and I kind of put it together from that angle. So I think that also finding pieces that are not inherently saying that they're part of the costume and making them become part of the costume is in itself a skill. There was also other skills involved that people talked to me about, like wig styling as being a skill, makeup, making good makeup as a skill. So these are all parts of the costume construction that's not necessarily sewing. That is inherent skills that that are important in transforming an individual into the character as their cosplay. One person that I spoke to, who I call Blake, really emphasized sewing construction as a really important element. To them, sewing was an incredibly important element of cosplay. Not everyone saw it this way. Some people bought costumes. Some people did what I did, where they get like sections and pieces from charity shops and either alter them or use them directly as is as the costume. So there's other things that people do, but for Blake, sewing and the actual constructing of the clothes was a really important and fundamental part of cosplay for them. Stevie was somebody who emphasized how important it was for the other elements. Stevie is somebody who always really wanted to get into costume construction, but currently doesn't have the money or the space in order to do that, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But they did emphasize the other aspects of costume construction that they are really interested in, like wig styling and makeup, and learning those skills and how to do those skills well in order to communicate the outfit in the way that they want to. Because wearing an outfit with one set of makeup versus another set of makeup could communicate a very different character. So knowing exactly how to do those things was really important for Stevie. Speaking of makeup, both Micah and Mason were two people that I spoke to who talked about makeup skills in particular. These were people who, again, bought costumes but put all of their kind of the construction element and that creativity into their makeup side and really, really learned makeup. I can't remember which one of them, but one of them told me that they once spent 2 hours doing their makeup for one of the costumes, which is insane. And I'm sure there's a lot of you listening to this that are like, that's nothing. But both Micah and Mason talked about also developing their own personal makeup style that carries over across cosplays so that it makes them inherently their cosplay rather than just a cosplay that doesn't detract from the character, but also makes it so that way you know it's them cosplaying it. So again, this is a particular skill involved, not only the skill of doing makeup in the first place, but doing makeup to the point where you have your own personal style with it that can be embedded within a multitude of other styles and characters. I talked about how Stevie kind of wanted to get into costume construction, but didn't have the resources for it. And this was something that was emphasized a couple of times, but I think most notably by Emma. Emma, who I spoke to, talked a lot about the resources of costume construction that not necessarily everyone has, that doesn't really have to do with money. They don't have the space to do things. That space involved in sewing is a big thing. But some of the people that I was speaking to live in a bedroom, and that is the space they have, is one room, and they just don't have the space to spread out fabric, to cut in the way that it needs to be cut, to set up a sewing machine in the way that a sewing machine needs to be set up. And so they just don't have that kind of resource. So it's not just a money element, it's also a lot of other things as well, right? It's the space, it's the time, it's the energy. All of these things are resources that people need in order to actually do costume construction. And this led to a discussion about elitism in cosplay. And I'm not gonna talk about this extensively here because I think it's kind of a whole other discussion, and I'm planning on having that discussion with a cosplayer soon for a podcast, which I will, if it's already out by the time this is happening, I'll link it in the description below because I can't remember when we're doing it. There's a discussion about elitism in cosplay that is based on costume construction. And this comes from the fact that a lot of cosplay competitions do not allow people to join if they have bought their costumes. So it is only allowed to people who have made their costumes. Some people see this as a fundamental problem of the cosplay community inherently saying that people who have made costumes are the only people doing quote-unquote good cosplay. As I said, this is kind of a full conversation, but I think it's a really interesting conversation, and I personally see both sides of the discussion. There was a nice quote from Bailey who was kind of talking about this elitism and this emphasis. And now Bailey is someone who sometimes makes costumes, sometimes buys, it depends on how they feel. And they emphasize the fact that a good costume is more about the performance of it and the way that a person understands the costume and understands the identity, which is going to be leading us into our second skill marker. And so Bailey really fell into the importance of skill is in that second camp, the skill in identity. But I thought that their quote in regards to making costumes was a really interesting one. They said, "I've made costumes and I've hated every second of being in them." And I thought this was a really nice way of kind of capturing that feeling of putting a lot of effort into something and it not being successful. But then sometimes they'll buy a costume and it'll be perfect and they'll feel great in it. And so for them, they really emphasize the fact that a good cosplay is a cosplay that you feel good in, that you can move in, that you can be the character in. You know, they kind of talked about people who build giant armor sets and then can't move. And they were like, well, but the character you're embodying can move. So you've lost something of the character in your emphasis on constructing it in a very particular way. So I think I'll kind of leave the costume construction there. So I think this brings us really well into our second discussion of skill, which is what I'm calling the identity knowledge skill. And I don't know if that's really the right term for it. It's because it is a more amorphous. It's a skill that isn't based on creating a thing. It's more about creating a vibe or creating a feeling, which I think is a lot harder to kind of point at and grasp. Part of this is the innate knowledge of the character themselves and how to portray that character, how to communicate that character, both in performance, say on a stage for a costume competition, or in photographs, how to capture the feel of that character in those moments, on TikToks, all of these different, or just walking around a con, really, like all of these different elements of how you communicate the character as a cosplayer. I think that's inherently in there. But I'm also adding to this the innate knowledge of how to connect a particular fictional character to a particular person. Most of the people that I spoke to, and probably about a good, I mean, I haven't done the maths on this, but like 90% of the people that I spoke to, I'd have to really go and sort through it, but like a massive majority of the people that I spoke to talked about how they would be able to pick a character for a friend to cosplay pretty accurately. Now, what's important about this is that it wasn't things based off of, oh, I can look at somebody and determine who they should cosplay based off of their looks. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who they know innately. Most of them said that they could do it with a really good friend, but not necessarily with a stranger. That they need to know the person's personality, essentially. They need to know who this person is as a person, and then they can connect a character to them based off of this knowledge of their personality and who they are. There's also an innate understanding of character in the sense of knowing what parts of the character need to be communicated to have somebody be able to see it and say, that's that character, and which ones they can't do that with. So what can you mix and match? What can you grab that means that you can see something out of its original context and recognize it for what it is? So I had one person, for example, was saying that they can kind of pick apart an outfit and know like what pieces are absolutely necessary to communicate the character effectively and which ones they can kind of get away with not doing. It cuts their workload down, especially if they're making a costume. This is also particularly important when it comes to props. I had somebody say that they tend to not do props unless it's necessary for communicating the character. Then they'll bring in a prop. But most of the time, if they can kind of figure out how to do it without that just by constructing the costume in the way that it needs to be constructing or picking the pieces of the costume out that they need to. So that means that someone can kind of look at the character and again, know what is necessary to communicate the character. It's an innate knowledge of character and a skill in recognizing how that character functions or moves or anything like that. There's also, therefore, a skill in a knowledge of how to perform the character and how to be the character and of the character itself. So I think each one of the other kind of 2 points really points to this as well, is knowing the personality of the person performing it. This is a very easy character for your personality to really mesh into. Knowing what you need or don't need to communicate the character. This is all understanding and a skill in recognizing the importance of certain elements and the importance of performance of a character. For example, Bailey, which we talked about in the same discussion where they were telling me about the elitism, they were talking about how it's not enough to look like the character, you have to also move like them, which again goes into this idea of the performance, right? You have to be able to capture the essence of this character in a lot more than just a still image. You have to, it was particularly if you're going to a con or if you're moving about on a stage for a thing, or if you're doing a TikTok for like a video or YouTube or something like that, you need to be able to have the more subtle ideas of the character in mind as well. Okay, so analysis time. I want to first talk about the idea of what is called enskilment. Enskilment is probably best explored through an article by Julie Passon. I'm probably saying that name wrong. I just realized I have never had to say it out loud before. But Passon talked about enskilment as a process of learning. So it's a type of learning, but it's a type of learning that is more innate, right? So we think of learning as, what's around me? I've got books, I've got notebooks, I've got pens, I have highlighters. This is probably what you think of as learning. This is the kind of formal education type of learning, but that's not the only type of learning that exists. People learn on the job every day at their jobs. A process of learning by doing, but also a process of learning by being. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. I think of it also as, and this might be not like a perfect analogy for it, but it's probably the one that's best explained, which is when you are learning another language and then you like go to a country that speaks that language and how fast you suddenly feel far more fluent than you were before. It's not because you are, I don't know, magically picking up more books or something. It's because the process of being there, the process of being socialized within that skill, you are more picking up of that skill. So enskilment is a process of like socialized knowledge. It's the knowledge that you get by being around people and by doing the thing with people. And I think all of this idea of enskilment is that kind of innate knowledge, those more quiet knowledge bits, but also in some ways the more direct skill thing as well. Like you learn about how to perform your cosplay better by being around other cosplayers. You learn about how to make your makeup you as well as your character, like Micah and Mason, who were able to do that with their makeup. They're able to do that through a process of enskilment. They've learned not only the skill of makeup, but that innate skill of communicating yourself and costume at the same time. That is, quite frankly, a very difficult skill to learn, and that's only a skill that you learn through the process of doing and being around other people doing. So I think that's it for skill for today. If you enjoyed this, you can subscribe to the channel so you can get more. I have, I think 2 or 3 more coming. I'm ending it in August because that's when the book's due to the publisher. But I'm thinking of doing an occasional update so that way you know what's kind of going on with the book until the book is out. And then maybe I'll start doing more videos on whatever the next project might be, because I never stop. But go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you can keep up on more. I also do more like traditional vloggy type vlogs about my life as a writer and what I'm doing. So if you want to know the more innate stuff, you can do that. You can also go and subscribe to my other channel, Incidental Mythology, where I do video essays. So discussions about mythology and popular culture are over there. Yeah, that's it. Hopefully, I will see you in the next video. Bye!